Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our story over the last couple of years. So back in 2017, our board, like any good board should, set us a very ambitious goal. And that goal was to work to tackle some of the major health challenges facing people living in inner city environments. So I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so telling you a little bit about that journey of trying to achieve that goal over the last couple of years and our plans going forward from there in our work as an urban health foundation. So as an urban health foundation, the way we go about achieving that goal and tackling some of those major health challenges affecting urban environments is by focusing our efforts down on Lambeth and Southwark, as Sue mentioned. And we think Lambeth and Southwark are a really important place to focus, not just because of the importance of some of the health challenges facing Lambeth and Southwark, but also because they are typical of many other inner city urban areas around the UK and around the world. So they're densely populated, they're hugely diverse in nature, so we have over 100 different languages spoken across Lambeth and Southwark. There's significant inequality across the boroughs, as you can see from some of the slides here. And alongside that, significant health inequalities as well. So we hope that by focusing our efforts down on Lambeth and Southwark, we can not only have an impact on the sorts of issues we're looking at there, but also hopefully have an impact by sharing what we're learning and helping others tackling similar issues elsewhere. So that's what we're setting out to do. I'm going to share 3 characteristics of the approach that we're testing across Lambeth and Southwark. So the first of those is the importance of being focused in what we're doing. We think that's a really critical part of making progress around some of these issues. The second is how we use that focus to be impact-led in the way that we work. And finally, how we bring both of those 2 things together to test a systems approach in practice across Lambeth and Southwark. So starting with focus, and we think focus is important for a very deliberate reason. So as we started to look at some of the issues facing places like Lambeth and Southwark, so they're typically intractable population health challenges, deeply linked to inequality, deeply linked to some of the social determinants of health, we came across 2 main responses. So the first of those was, okay, so we have to look at the broad determinants of health. Does that mean we need to do everything? And what we often observed is people trying to do everything, which of course is absolutely the right thing to do, and Health Foundation's work on trying to help frame what we need to do has been really helpful in that regard. But what we experience on the ground is that doesn't necessarily lead to progress and to action in a place. So that was the first thing that started to make us think about focus. The second, and drawing on, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the Foresight work around childhood obesity a few years ago, once people get into that issue of social determinants and the interaction between a place, the sorts of people that live in that place and the nature of health in that place, people then start to get into the complexity of that issue and often, I think, struggle to know where to start. So given that context, we made a very explicit decision to be very focused in what we do. So we're being very focused in the place that we work, so the London boroughs of Lambeth and Southwark, but within that we're being very focused on the types of issues that we're working on as well. So we're starting off with a small portfolio of issues for the next 10 years. As Sue mentioned, we're planning to put up to 250 million into those 4 issues over that 10-year period, and we hope to have a very specific impact within those issues during that time period. So that's why we think focus is important. But focus has also been really important to help us to be what I think is truly impact-led in the way we're trying to work. And I emphasise on trying in this. We certainly don't have all the answers. So by impact-led, what I mean by that is by being focused, it's enabled us to get deep into the sorts of issues we're looking at. It's enabled us to look at the symptoms of those issues in a place and the nature of how that transpires for the people in that place. So that's both at an individual and a system level. Get into the underlying drivers of why those symptoms might exist, and then carve out some very specific goals for what our programs are trying to achieve and a very specific approach to how we're trying to achieve that. So I thought I'd bring that to life a little bit with the example of our multiple long-term conditions program. So 2 years ago, we started working on this program and faced a pretty difficult challenge. So as any of you that have worked on this issue will know, there's very little data. So finding out what was happening for people with multiple long-term conditions was very hard. There's very little understanding of actually what's going on around multimorbidity, although we know obviously a huge amount around individual conditions. And there's very little evidence to know what to do about it. So faced with that context, we spent the last year or so really trying to unpack this issue and trying to understand what does it mean for a place like Lambeth and Southwark. So as we got into that, a few interesting things started to emerge. So the first is, although we see significant correlation between multiple long-term conditions and age, as we started to look into the data, what we saw is over a third of people living with multiple long-term conditions, and this data is from Lambeth, are under 65. So although there's the appearance of this issue being about aging, which of course it is to some extent, it's not just an issue of old age. So that led us down a deeper path to start to look at that in a bit more detail. And we started to look at how the prevalence of this issue is playing out in a place like Lambeth and Southwark, rather than just looking purely at the age distribution. And that started to really unpick, both by combining data analysis alongside the lived experience of people living in Lambeth and Southwark, a real clarity around the importance of people's social context and the places where they live in terms of their progression from one to many conditions. So then we kind of got into that a bit further and started to look at the relationship not just between the prevalence levels and the place, but also the journey to that state of multimorbidity as well. And that started to uncover what we now think is the major impact opportunity to be truly impact-led around this issue over the next 10 years. And that's the significant variation that we see in a place like Lambeth and Southwark between those in the most affluent wards and some of the most in the more deprived areas. So in some of the most deprived parts of Lambeth and Southwark, you are typically experiencing 3 or more conditions up to 10 to 15 years earlier than those in the more affluent areas. And we think that presents a significant opportunity for us to have a population level impact through our work and through our work with partners locally over the next 10 years. So that's the goal that we've set ourselves now. It's a very specific issue in a specific place, and now a very specific goal. And that goal is to slow down people's progression from one to many conditions by focusing on those at risk of rapid progression. So that's why we think focus is important. How we think focus has helped us to be very impact-led in the way we're approaching our work. But we think it's a combination of those two things that is starting to help us test a systems-based approach in practice. So to help bring that to life a little bit, I'll finish by just telling you a little bit about how we're approaching the issue of childhood obesity in Lambeth and Southwark as part of that. So what we're trying to achieve, where we're trying to do that, and finally, how we're trying to use that focus to go then very broad and look at the whole system that might be able to influence achieving that goal over the next 10 years. So our goal for our childhood obesity programme is about closing the gap of childhood obesity levels between the most affluent and the most deprived parts of Lambeth and Southwark. So for children living in Camberwell Green right now, up to 1 in 3 of those will be obese by age 11. In contrast, if you live in one of the most affluent areas, Dulwich Village, only 1 in 3 will be. So we think that is the issue that we should be focusing on as an independent foundation and trying to have an impact to show, hopefully, how you can really shift the dial on the inequality of how childhood obesity plays out in a place like Lambeth and Southwark. Where we're focusing is this corridor that sits across the middle of our 2 boroughs. And those of you who are more eagle-eyed will have noticed this early on in the presentation. That's where a lot of the health issues seem to play out in the place where we work. So we're going to focus very specifically on those wards that sit across the kind of mid to top band of our boroughs to try and have the impact and achieve that goal of closing the gap. How we want to do that is by drawing on the best evidence that exists at the moment and ultimately trying to make it easier to access healthy, affordable options, both food and physical activity in the homes, schools and streets where children and families spend their time. So it's that focus on a specific goal in a specific place with a very specific approach to how we set out to achieve that. What that has enabled us to do is then go extremely broad in the way we're looking to try and achieve that goal. And we typically talk about our systems approach and how we're trying to do that in practice by layering up cumulative activity in a place around the environmental domains that we talk about, so home, school and street, and trying to change the nature of those environments to help support healthier food and physical activity options for families and young people on low incomes. But also, and very importantly, layer up at different scales of geography as well. So we're working very intensively at a neighbourhood level, very hyper-locally in specific neighbourhoods within Lambeth and Southwark, like Faraday in Southwark as an example of that, to do multiple things in that place to try and create an intensive effect at a neighbourhood level within some of those areas of the highest levels of childhood obesity in our boroughs. At a borough level, we're working, of course, very closely with colleagues across public health and the wider council and NHS system, but also importantly going much more broadly than that. So our partnership with Consumer Goods Forum is an example of that, where we're working in partnership with all the major retailers and consumer goods organisations to try and increase access to affordable, healthy options in retail environments across Lambeth and Southwark. Then finally, then at the London level, an example of that work would be working with the Mayor of London. So we've actively invested in the Mayor's task force for childhood obesity. And then finally, at a national level, we also will operate as well. So when we can't see a route to tackling some of the challenges working in place, we work in partnership with others to try and look at how we tackle that at a national level. And our partnership with Share Action is a good example of that, where we're working with many other partners to look at how we might influence consumer goods companies' formulation of products through shareholder action. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what we mean by a systems approach, but it would be remiss of me to not mention impact management as a key final component of this. So I specifically use the word management and not measurement here, not because we don't think measurement's important, but we think the route to really tackling things at a systems level is by investing significantly in the systems and processes around how we measure and understand impact, not at the end of the programme, but throughout its journey. And that enables us, we hope, to course correct as we go, learn about what may or may not work and making a contribution towards the goal we're trying to achieve. So in summary, we think that being focused, using that to then be impact-led and bringing those two together to then take a systems approach is what's helping us start to make progress towards these sorts of issues. But I should emphasise that we're only 2 years into the journey of a 10-year programme, so I don't have the answers for you yet. But what I can promise is that we will, as Sue mentioned, we'll continue to share everything that we're doing. We'll continue to be honest about what's working and what's not working. And hopefully through that will help not just ourselves working in Lambeth and Southwark, but those of you working in city areas elsewhere. Thanks very much.